Hola aventurero, I am Noewel Cura, you can call me Noye, and I will be your shepherd throughout this journey. First, let's get to know each other, shall we? What alias should I call you by? Nice meeting you, Cream. Our main objective is to acquire the knowledge scattered across the map of 𝗘𝗗𝗣𝗬𝗏𝗧, namely psychodynamic theory, psychosexual stages of human development, and behavioral theory. Without further ado, let's get started. Psychodynamic theory. To define, psychodynamics is the study of the interrelationship of various parts of the mind, personality, or psyche as they relate to mental, emotional, or motivational forces, especially at the unconscious level. A notable person in the psychodynamic theory is Sigmund Freud. He is the founder of psychoanalysis. He stated that an individual's personality is controlled by unconscious mental processes that are grounded from early childhood. The unconscious mind is a reservoir of feelings, thoughts, urges, and memories that are outside of our conscious awareness. To understand human behavior better, Sigmund Freud created the theory of personality. It comprises three separate but interacting parts: the id, the superego, and the ego. The id is the instinctual drive that demands immediate gratification to basic urges, needs, and desire. For example, the personality of a newborn child is all an id, and only later does it develop an ego and superego. Why? Because a newborn child is very demanding of his basic needs, diba? They cry when they are hungry, they cry when their diapers are full, they cry when they are placed in an uncomfortable position. That is an example of the id. Next, the superego incorporates the values of morals of society which are learned from one's parents and others. It develops around the age of 3 to 5 years old during the phallic stage of psychosexual development. The superego is a part of the unconscious that is the voice of conscience and the source of self-criticism. Let me repeat that. The superego is a part of the unconscious that is the voice of conscience and the source of self-criticism. Next, the ego develops later on in our life to mediate between the unrealistic id and the external real world. It is the decision-making component of personality. Ideally, the ego works by reason, whereas the id is chaotic and unreasonable. Freud made the analogy of the id being a horse, while the ego is the rider. He stated that the ego is like a man on horseback, who has to hold in check the superior strength of the horse. An example of a healthy psyche is when the ego is in control over the id and the superego. Psychodynamic theory sees criminal behavior as a conflict between the id, the ego, and the superego. This conflict can lead to problematic behavior and even in crime. In view of superego's focus on morality, the proponents of this theory suggest that an individual committed a crime because they have an underdeveloped superego. An example for this, I know now we hear a lot of phrases from freshly convicted criminals upon their arrest, diba? They say something similar to, sir, sorry sir, kaya ko lang po nagawa yun kasi po nandilim po yung paningin ko. Something like that. So in this situation, they let their id, their aggressiveness, their prime instincts to control them, without first consulting the superego, which is our moral compass, and the ego, which is our rational personality. That is all to learn about psychodynamic theory. Next, let's learn about psychosexual stages of human development. Freud believed that personality developed through a series of childhood stages in which pleasure-seeking energies of the id become focused on certain erogenous areas. An erogenous zone is characterized as an area of the body that is particularly sensitive to stimulation. The psychosexual energy, also called as libido, was described as the driving force behind behavior. Let's break down the 5 stages of psychosexual development. The first stage is what we call the oral stage. which we develop from birth to 1 year old. During this stage, the infant's primary source of interaction occurs through the mouth. So the rooting and sucking reflex is especially important. The mouth is vital for eating, and the infant derives pleasure from oral stimulation through gratifying activities such as tasting and sucking. The primary conflict at this stage is the weaning process. It is important for the child to become less dependent on their caretakers. If fixation occurs at this age, Freud believes the individual would have issues with either dependency or aggression. We can see a lot of oral personalities around us, no? The smokers, the person who bite their nails, the one who suck on their thumbs, and many more. These are the causes of oral fixation. People tend to engage in the activities aforementioned when they are under stress. Next is the anal stage. During this stage of psychosexual development, the libido becomes focused on the bowel movement and the anus, and the child derives great pleasure from defecating. The child is also now fully aware that they are the person in their own right, and that their wishes can bring them into conflict with the demands of the outside world. So in other words, their ego has now developed. Freud believed that this type of conflict tends to come to a head in toilet training, in which adults impose restrictions on when and where the child can defecate. Fixations at this stage can result into two types of personality. 1. If the parents are too strict or began toilet training too early, the individual would become severe, orderly, rigged, and obsessive. And if the parents took an approach that is too reflexive or began toilet training too late, the individual would become an untidy, wasteful, or destructive personality. Next, the phallic stage is the third stage of psychosexual development, spanning the ages of 3 to 6 years old, wherein the infant's libido centers upon the genitalia as the erogenous zone. The child becomes aware of the anatomical sex differences, which sets in motion the conflict between erotic attraction, resentment, rivalry, jealousy, and fear, which Freud called the Oedipus complex in boys and the Electra complex in girls. This is resolved through the process of identification, which involves the child adopting the characteristics of the same-sex parent. So I have my own experience about this. When I was a kid, I don't know what age I was at that time, but I can clearly remember sneaking up to my father's room. I grabbed his razors and I shaved my non-existent beard in an attempt to mimic his morning routine. So I wounded myself because of that. That was an example of the phallic stage. May it be a child being more sweet to their parents than usual to grab their attention, to copy them. Those and all are examples of the phallic stage. A fixation at this stage can cause vanity, self-obsession, sexual anxiety, inadequacy, inferiority, and envy. Fourth stage is called the latency stage, spanning the period of 6 years old to puberty. During this stage, the libido is dormant and no further psychosexual development takes place. Freud thought that most sexual impulses are repressed during the latent stage, and sexual energy can be sublimated towards schoolwork, hobbies, and friendships. Much of the child's energy is channeled into developing new skills and acquiring new knowledge, and play becomes more largely confined to other children of the same gender. The last stage of the psychosexual development is the genital stage. The onset of puberty causes the libido to become active again. Thus, the individual develops a strong sexual interest with other people, as it is the time of adolescent sexual experimentation. According to Freud, the ego and the superego were fully formed and functioning at this stage, so the individual should be able to balance their most basic urges against the need to conform to social norms. Sexual instinct is directed to heterosexual pleasure rather than self-pleasure like during the phallic stage. For Freud, the proper outlet of the sexual instinct in adults was through heterosexual intercourse. Fixation and conflict may prevent this, with the consequence that sexual perversion may develop. For example, fixations at the oral stage may result in a person gaining sexual pleasure primarily from kissing and oral sex, rather than the sexual intercourse itself. So that is all to learn about psychosexual stages of human development. Next is the behavioral theory. Behaviorism, also known as behavioral psychology, is a theory of learning based on the idea that all behaviors are acquired through conditioning, and conditioning occurs through the interaction with the environment. Behaviorists believe that our actions are shaped by environmental stimuli. We have two types of different behaviorism. The first one is methodological behaviorism. It states that observable behavior should be studied scientifically and that mental states and cognitive processes don't add to the understanding of behavior. This type of behaviorism aligns with John Watson's ideologies and approach. The other type of behaviorism is called radical behaviorism. It is rooted in the theory that behavior can be understood by looking at one's past and present environment and the reinforcement within it, thereby influencing behavior either positively or negatively. Next, let's learn about the classical conditioning. It is a technique frequently used in behavioral training in which a neutral stimulus is paired with a naturally occurring stimulus. Eventually, the neutral stimulus comes to evoke the same response as the naturally occurring stimulus would, even without the latter presenting itself. Wait, no yet. That's a lot of complicated terms. Slow down. Give us an example. Okay, so an experiment that supports classical conditioning is called Pavlov's dog. Naturally, diba, dogs salivate when presented with food, right? So in this experiment, Pavlov associated the food with the ring of a bell. So every time they deliver the food to the dogs, they ring the bell. Eventually, the dog starts to salivate with only the ring of the bell, even without the sight of the food. The food here is called the naturally occurring stimulus, and the ring of the bell is the neutral stimulus. Let me repeat that. The food here is called the naturally occurring stimulus, and the ring of a bell is the neutral stimulus. Throughout the course of 3 distinct phases of classical conditioning, the associated stimulus becomes known as the conditioned stimulus, and the learned behavior is known as the conditioned response. Next is the operant conditioning. Operant conditioning, on the other hand, is a method of learning that occurs through reinforcement and punishment. Through this type of conditioning, an association is made between a behavior and a consequence of that behavior. This behavioral approach says that when a desirable result follows an action, the behavior becomes more likely to happen again. On the other hand, responses followed by adverse outcomes becomes less likely to occur. Like us, diba? We like getting praise. We like hearing that we did a good job and all, and after that, we tend to do well again next time. But when we are punished for something, of course, naturally, we won't repeat the same action, diba? Well, unless you are a huge masochist. Joke lang. Behavioral theory revolves around the idea that human behavior develops through experience, specifically focusing on the idea that people develop their behavior based on the reaction their behavior gets from those around them. So, for example, we can all agree that children are born innocently, diba? But when a child is raised in the streets, let's say, when the child is raised in the streets and the child is surrounded by bad figures, let's say, for example, a thief, a criminal, in general, a criminal, the child is surrounded by criminal. Of course, naturally, the child would copy the criminals. The tendency is that the child will become criminal himself because that's how he grew up. That's his environment. According to Albert Bandura in 1978, individuals are not born with an innate ability to act violently, and therefore suggests that violence and aggression are learned through a process of behavior modeling from family interaction, environmental experiences, that's like what I said earlier, and mass media. So that is all to learn about behavioral theory. Thank you. I hope you learned something in this video. If you want to study about this topic more, I will leave a copy of the PowerPoint presentation, a more detailed PowerPoint presentation below. So unrelated to my report, I just like to say na with the elections coming up, I hope we all do our own research regarding the candidates. We learn to distinguish fake news and credible sources. We do not let other people's opinion waver our own. If we know to ourselves that we are right, and we need to learn to accept mistakes and not be humiliated by other people educating us, diba? Because that's for our own good naman. Let's be kind-hearted and let's vote wisely. I would like to end this video with a quote from the great Ionian Greek philosopher Pythagoras. Choices are the hinges of destiny, so whatever you choose today, make sure na you don't regret it tomorrow. So that's all. Adios.